All right, so get this. January 2025, Trump is back for his second term.
Round two.
Exactly. And within 45 hours, he drops this bombshell
Oh, yeah.
that has everybody scrambling. And we are talking about the infamous federal spending freeze.
Yeah.
You sent over a ton of articles and your notes on this, so I figured let's unpack this whole thing together.
Absolutely. This was a wild period.
Yeah.
And, it wasn't just another executive order. This memo from the Office of Management and Budget,
The OMB.
the OMB,
Yeah.
right? It attempted to freeze spending on trillions of dollars.
Trillions with a T.
Trillions with a T in federal grants and loans.
That's a lot of money.
What was the reaction when this memo dropped?
Well, you can imagine confusion, outrage, and
Yeah.
agencies just scrambling, trying to figure out what it all meant.
Yeah.
The memo itself was super vague, using phrases like,
What?
must temporarily pause,
Wow.
which a lot of people interpreted as just like a blanket freeze on everything.
Okay, hold on, pause. What exactly?
What?
How do you even begin to unravel that? Well, to make things even more confusing, the OMB sent out this spreadsheet
Oh, great.
that listed over 2,500 programs
Wow.
that were suddenly under review. And on top of that, the memo claimed nearly $10 trillion in outlays.
Really?
Yeah, which was way off a cell. The actual figure was closer to 6.75 trillion.
Okay, so we've got vague language, a massive list of programs, and a wildly inaccurate number. I can see why people were freaking out.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the agencies. Even Republicans in Congress were blindsided by this whole thing.
Really?
Yeah, they were getting bombarded with questions from their constituents
Sure.
and had no answers because they were in the dark just like everyone else.
So it sounds like the White House really fumbled this one. What was their response to all this chaos?
Well, initially they just deflected blame. They pointed fingers at the media,
Of course.
said it was all fake news.
Classic.
Yeah, Stephen Miller, one of Trump's top advisors,
Ah.
he dismissed the concerns as, just a media-driven frenzy.
So basically they claimed it was all just a big misunderstanding.
Yeah, that was the initial stance.
Mm-hmm.
But then, just 45 hours after that initial memo, the OMB issues another memo, this one very brief, rescinding the entire spending freeze.
Wow, that is a quick turnaround. What prompted that?
Well, 20 hours before the freeze was lifted, a federal judge actually ordered a halt to it after a lawsuit from liberal groups.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, this legal challenge, along with all the mounting pressure and confusion,
Yeah.
probably forced the White House's hand.
So they backpedaled, but did they at least own up to the mess they made?
Not really. The White House press secretary at the time, Caroline Leavitt, issued a statement that said, this action should effectively end the court case and allow the government to focus on enforcing the president's orders on controlling federal spending.
That doesn't sound like an apology at all. Did Trump himself ever address this whole thing?
He did. He defended the freeze, claiming they were simply looking at parts of the big bureaucracy where there's been tremendous waste and fraud and abuse.
Of course he did.
He even doubled down,
No.
citing a debunked claim about $50 million going to Gaza for condoms.
Wow, he really likes that talking point.
He does.
Okay, but if they were truly focused on, tackling waste and fraud, why not target those specific areas instead of throwing the entire government into disarray? It seems like there might have been another motive at play here.
That's a great point. The administration claimed they wanted to prevent career officials from spending money in ways that didn't align with Trump's policies.
Okay.
They pointed to incidents like USAID officials allegedly trying to circumvent Trump's foreign aid freeze, and HHS employees supposedly pushing money to NGOs that worked on migrant resettlement.
So basically they're saying these career government employees were going rogue.
Yeah, essentially undermining the president's agenda.
And this plays into the whole, deep state thing that Trump was always going on about.
Exactly. He had this deep distrust of the deep state, believed they were actively working against him. But there's another layer to this story that I think you'll find really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So the memo directing this spending freeze was actually spearheaded by Russell Vought,
Okay.
Trump's pick for OMB director. The thing is, he hadn't even been officially confirmed for the role yet.
Hold on, so he was calling the shots before he even had the job? That seems a little unusual.
Very unusual. It raises questions about, the decision-making process and his authority at the time. But it gets even more ironic.
Oh boy, how so?
So even though the memo came from Vought, it was actually signed by Matthew Vaith.
Who's that?
He was the acting OMB director, a career official who had been with the OMB for decades.
Hold on, so they're trying to rein in career officials who they believe are undermining Trump's agenda, but then a career official signs the memo.
It's pretty ironic, isn't it?
That's a pretty big contradiction. Did anyone in the administration even comment on that?
One GOP aide summed it up pretty well.
What'd they say?
They said, kind of runs counter to the whole reason Trump's guys are taking a blowtorch to federal workers up and down.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so we've got confusion, conflicting motives, and a whole lot of irony all packed into these 45 hours. This definitely feels like it was about a lot more than just a spending freeze.
Absolutely. This episode gives us a glimpse into the chaos and the conflicting motivations that really seem to define the Trump administration.
Well, it's amazing how this whole thing, only lasted less than 2 days,
45 hours.
but reveals so much about how the government works or doesn't work, as the case may be.
Yeah, it's like you're looking through a microscope at this tiny sample,
Uh-huh.
and you see this entire universe inside of it.
Wow.
This wasn't just about budget numbers. This was a symptom of something much larger going on.
Like what?
Well, think about the way they went about this. They attempted to halt trillions of dollars in spending with
Yeah.
a two-page memo and a spreadsheet.
It's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. It speaks to a pattern of impulsive decision-making,
Yeah.
a disregard for, norms and procedures,
Right.
this urge to push the boundaries of executive power.
It does seem pretty reckless, and ultimately they had to back down almost immediately.
Yeah, exactly. And that highlights the flawed nature of their approach.
Yeah.
It wasn't just inefficient, it was ineffective.
It makes you wonder about the competence of, the people in charge.
Yeah, that was a question a lot of people were asking, both inside and outside the administration. There were whispers, even among some Republicans, about whether Trump's team was really equipped to govern.
Interesting.
They felt like the administration was too chaotic and disorganized to handle the complexities of government.
So this spending freeze wasn't just an isolated incident, it was more like a symptom of a larger dysfunction.
Exactly. And when you zoom out and think about the long-term implications of this kind of
Yeah.
governing style,
Yeah.
it's pretty concerning.
Like, what kind of implications are we talking about here?
Well, think about how this impacts, the average person's view of government.
Right.
When people see their government acting in such a haphazard and reckless manner, it erodes their trust,
Yeah, makes sense.
not just in a specific administration, but in the institution of government itself.
So it's not just about this one event, it's about the potential for lasting damage to public faith in the system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that can lead to cynicism, apathy, a decline in civic engagement. It creates a vicious cycle where people just become disillusioned and withdraw from the political process, making it even harder to address the challenges we face.
Yeah, because if people don't trust their government to solve problems, they're less likely to support policies aimed at doing so.
Exactly. This whole incident with the spending freeze, it's a reminder that, trust in government is a precious commodity. And once it's lost, it's incredibly difficult to regain.
We've talked about the chaos and the fallout from this spending freeze.
Yeah.
But there's another piece of this puzzle that's really intriguing.
What's that?
The legal challenges. Remember, a federal judge actually stopped the freeze just hours before the White House reversed course.
Right. That's a crucial part of this story.
Yeah.
It shows that even a president known for pushing boundaries is not above the law. That legal challenge brought by those liberal groups was really instrumental in bringing the whole thing to a halt.
Does seem like a pretty clear-cut case of executive overreach. Were there any conservatives who shared that concern?
Yeah, actually, even among some of Trump's supporters, there was this growing sense of unease with his approach.
Interesting.
The spending freeze incident really brought those anxieties to the forefront and forced a conversation about, how much power a president should have.
That's a huge question. You're right. It raises fundamental questions about the balance of power in our government. What role did Congress play in all this? I know they weren't too happy about being left out of the loop.
No, they were furious.
Hmm.
Congressional Republicans felt like the White House was completely sidelining them,
Really?
trying to just run the government by decree.
Mm-hmm.
And that sets a dangerous precedent.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be upset.
Because if Congress allows the president to control spending single-handedly, they're basically giving up their constitutional duty to, oversee the nation's purse strings.
So what can they do to push back and reclaim their authority?
Well, they have a few tools. They can hold hearings, launch investigations, and even pass laws that limit presidential power.
Uh-huh.
And of course, they have the power of the purse.
Right.
They can restrict funding for programs they disagree with.
So it sounds like they have a lot of options to keep the president in check.
They do. And it's vital that they use those options. Regardless of which party is in the White House, ultimately it's about protecting that delicate balance of power that's at the heart of our democracy.
Right. It's that whole system of checks and balances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Founding Fathers were pretty smart about this. They divided power among the three branches of government
Mm.
to prevent any one person or entity from becoming too powerful.
And it's worked pretty well for over 2 centuries.
It has, but it requires constant vigilance. If one branch starts grabbing too much power, the others need to push back.
And that's exactly what we saw with this whole spending freeze saga. Both the courts and Congress stepped in to rein in the executive branch.
Yeah. It was a messy process, no doubt about it. But in the end, it reaffirmed this core principle. Nobody, not even the president, is above the law.
And that's a powerful message for everyone,
It is.
not just, those in positions of power.
It reminds us that we all have a role to play in safeguarding our democracy.
Absolutely.
We need to stay informed, engage in the process, and hold our leaders accountable.
I think as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling kind of a mix of concern and hope. Concern about, the fragility of our system, but also hope that we can learn from these events.
I agree. There's a lot to be worried about, but there's also reason for optimism. We can learn from these mistakes and strive to build a stronger, more resilient democracy.
And that's something worth fighting for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course.
We've covered a lot of ground, but I think the most important takeaway is this. If a 45-hour spending freeze can trigger this much chaos and debate, what does that say about the state of our political system?
That's a great question. It suggests that we can't take our democracy for granted.
Yeah.
We need to actively protect and defend it every single day. It's a responsibility we all share.
Well said. And on that note, we'll sign off. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning. It's amazing how this whole spending freeze, only lasted less than 2 days.
45 hours.
Right, but it reveals so much about how the government works, or doesn't work,
Right.
as the case may be.
It really does. It's like looking through a microscope at this tiny sample,
Uh-huh.
and you see this whole universe in it.
Wow.
This wasn't just about budget numbers. This was a symptom of a much larger problem.
Like what?
Well, think about how they went about this. They tried to stop trillions of dollars in spending
Right.
with a 2-page memo and a spreadsheet.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you put it like that.
It is. It really shows this pattern of impulsive decision-making, disregard for norms and procedures,
Right.
and this constant urge to push the boundaries of executive power.
Yeah, it does seem pretty reckless. And ultimately, they had to back down almost right away.
Exactly. And the fact that they were forced to reverse course so quickly, it highlights how flawed their approach was.
Yeah.
It wasn't just inefficient. It was ineffective.
It makes you wonder about the competence of the people in charge,
Yeah, a lot of people were asking that question both inside and outside the administration.
Really?
Oh, yeah. There were even whispers among some Republicans about whether Trump's team was really up to the job.
Interesting.
They felt like the administration was too chaotic, too disorganized to really handle the complexities of government.
So this whole spending freeze wasn't an isolated incident. It was like a symptom of this larger dysfunction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you zoom out and think about the long-term implications of this kind of governing,
Yeah.
it gets pretty concerning.
What kind of implications are we talking about?
Well, think about how this impacts how the average person views the government.
Oh, okay.
When people see their government acting in such a reckless and haphazard way, it really erodes trust.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's not just trust in a specific administration, it's trust in the whole institution.
Yeah, right. A whole system.
Right. And that can lead to cynicism, apathy, a decline in civic engagement. It creates this vicious cycle where people become disillusioned and withdraw from the political process. And that makes it even harder to address the challenges we face as a country.
Because if people don't trust their government to solve problems, they're less likely to get behind policies to do so.
Exactly. And I think this whole incident with the spending freeze, it's just this powerful reminder that, trust in government is fragile.
Yeah.
And once it's lost, it's really hard to get back.
So we talked about the chaos, the fallout from this spending freeze.
Right.
But there's another piece of this whole puzzle that I find really fascinating.
What's that?
The legal challenges.
Oh, yeah.
Like a federal judge actually put a stop to the freeze just hours before the White House backtracked.
Yeah, that's a really important part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
It really shows that even a president who's known for pushing the limits
Yeah.
is not above the law.
Yeah.
That lawsuit from those liberal groups was a big reason the whole thing came to a screeching halt.
It does seem like a pretty clear case of executive overreach. Did any conservatives share that concern?
Actually, yeah, even among some of Trump's supporters, there was this growing feeling of uneasiness with his approach.
Interesting.
The spending freeze incident
Mm-hmm.
really brought those concerns to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of forced this conversation about, how much power a president should actually have.
It's a huge question.
It is.
It raises fundamental questions about the balance of power in our government.
Absolutely.
And what role did Congress play in all of this? I know they weren't too happy about being left out of the loop.
No, they were not.
Yeah.
Congressional Republicans were furious. They felt like the White House was completely ignoring them,
Really?
trying to just run the government by decree. And that sets a pretty dangerous precedent.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be upset.
If Congress lets the president control all the spending,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they're basically giving up their constitutional duty to oversee the budget.
So what can they do to kind of push back and reclaim their authority?
Well, they have a few tools in their belt.
Mm-hmm.
They can hold hearings, launch investigations. They can even pass laws that limit presidential power.
Okay.
And then, of course, there's always the power of the purse.
Right.
They can restrict funding for programs they don't like.
So it sounds like they've got a lot of options to keep the president in check.
They do, and it's super important that they use those options,
Yeah.
regardless of which party is in the White House. It's all about protecting that balance of power.
Right.
That's really at the heart of our democracy.
It's that whole system of checks and balances, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The Founding Fathers were pretty smart about this. They divided power between the three branches of government,
Mm-hmm.
specifically to prevent any one person or group from becoming too powerful.
And it's worked pretty well for over 2 centuries.
It has, but it takes constant vigilance.
Mm-hmm.
If one branch tries to grab too much power,
Yeah.
the others need to push back.
And that's what we saw play out with this whole spending freeze thing. Both the courts and Congress stepped in to put the brakes on the executive branch.
Right. It was a messy process for sure.
Yeah.
But in the end, it reaffirmed this core principle. Nobody, not even the president, is above the law.
And that's a really important message for everyone,
It is.
not just, the people in power.
It reminds us that we all play a part in protecting our democracy. We need to stay informed and engaged and hold our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling this mix of concern and hope, concern about how fragile our system is, but also hope that, maybe we can learn from all of this.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a lot to worry about, but there's also reason to be optimistic.
Yeah.
We can learn from these mistakes and work towards building a stronger, more resilient democracy.
And that's a fight worth having. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We covered a lot of ground today, but I think the biggest takeaway is this. If a 45-hour spending freeze can cause this much chaos and debate, what does that say about where our political system is?
That's a really great question, and it suggests that we can't take our democracy for granted. We need to actively protect and defend it every day. It's a responsibility that we all share.
Well said. And on that note, we'll sign off. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.